Hey everybody, it's Luca from Rackets and Runners. So unfortunately, we have entered that time of the year where there are no racket releases for basically the next 4 months until the Australian Open. So I figured it would be a good time to make another tier list video. That previous tier list I broke down into 2 parts, 95 to 98 square inch rackets and then 100 square inch rackets. I'm also gonna break this one up into 2 parts because there's like 45 rackets and it would take way too long to cover all of them. But instead of making 2 separate tier lists, I'm gonna combine them all. So I'm gonna start with the rackets we have today, and then I think next week or the week after, I'll add all the rest of the rackets to the tier list. And from then on, we're gonna have a rolling tier list that we update probably every year, maybe every 6 months, kind of depending on how many rackets come out and how much I think the tier list needs to change. So I think I'm covering 27 of like the 50 rackets we have today, and I've decided to separate them by control versus power rackets. Now, some of those it was really easy to do, others not so much. There's definitely some questionable decisions in here. So it's not really a control rackets tier list. I just needed to separate them pretty much evenly down the middle. And I do just quickly want to go over what a tier list actually is because I do get this question quite a bit. So a tier list is basically a sort of ranking, kind of like a grading system. It starts with S tier, which I believe stands for superior, and then it goes A, B, C, D, and I've added an F tier for this one. And obviously, like with any ranking system, I do just want to specify that this is 100% my personal preference. So if your racket is ranked lower than you'd like, that may just be because it doesn't work for me personally. That doesn't mean it's a bad racket whatsoever. So just wanted to address that. And of course, let me just remind you that any of the rackets we talk about on this channel, you can check out on our website, racketsandrunners.ca, which brings me nicely into another point. There's not going to be every single racket in the world on this tier list because it's only the rackets that we carry in the store. I can only talk about rackets that we carry at the store because those are generally the ones I try, and obviously because we're trying to sell these rackets. So if you want us to bring in more rackets, you got to buy more rackets. Great marketing right there. And also, please don't hesitate to comment on this video. There's gonna be some controversial opinions here, and I am more than willing to start a conversation in that comment section. So it's gonna be a fun one, but anyways, now let's get into the tier list. Okay, so we're gonna start off with a racket that actually wasn't in either of the tier lists last year, the Dunlop CX200 Tour. It kind of represents a dying breed of rackets. Thin beam 95s are becoming more and more rare nowadays, with kind of good reason. They obviously don't have the power and the spin that you almost need in the modern game. Now, I actually think the CX200 Tour is a very well executed 95 square inch 1820 because Dunlop has added stabilization tech to this frame that makes it way more playable at low static and swing weight specs. And what that does, especially that lower swing weight, is mean that you can bring this racket through contact really quickly, which helps generate more power and spin. In the past, with smaller head-sized 1820s like this, for them to be stable enough, they needed a lot of weight, which meant either you had to be an insanely good player to swing them, or if you weren't quite as good, you could still benefit from that control, but then you'd lose out big time on power and spin. With this CX200 Tour, you still get great control and feel like you would expect from a 95, but that lower weight spec playability makes it quite competitive in terms of power and spin. So I'm gonna put it in the A tier, but anyways, let's move on to the Shift 99 Pro. Now, the Shift 99 Pro I think is actually a really good racket, but it does suffer a little bit from an identity crisis to the point where I don't really know who would go for this racket. When the Shift line first came out, it was pretty obvious that Wilson was marketing it to be a spin line, but this is an 18 by 20, and you obviously can hit spin with an 18 by 20, but nobody's really gonna pick an 1820 when they're going for a dedicated spin racket. Now, the Shift is unique because yes, it's a spin racket, but it has a constant beam, it's not too thick, and it's a 99. So it's not a wild spin racket the way something like an Extreme MP is. And I actually think that adding an 18 by 20 string pattern to it tames it even more to the point where it actually becomes pretty good for control. The problem with the Shift line is that the feel when you're not hitting with spin is definitely a little bit unique and off-putting to a lot of people. So I'm going to put it in the D tier. I don't know what they could do to make this better because I think that vertical bending is just always going to make the racket feel a little bit weird. I would just say maybe make this a heavier Shift 99 and scrap the 18x20 string pattern. You'll have a bit more plow through and stability than the Shift 99 and still that incredible access to spin that it gives. It's not that this one isn't spin friendly. In fact, I think it's one of the most spin friendly 18x20s, but it does just feel a little bit weird to have a true spin racket be an 1820. Okay, so the Boom Pro. Now, I did want to talk about this one right away because obviously I made that top 5 favorite rackets video last week, and the Boom Pro wasn't on it, even though it's the racket that I use when I'm not playtesting. I did kind of mention in that video there's a difference between really liking a racket and playing your best tennis with a racket, and the Boom kind of represents that pretty well. I enjoy hitting with the Boom. In fact, it probably would have been 6th on that list, but there are a few things that take away from my enjoyment compared to those 5. But first, let's talk about what's good about the Boom. So the number one thing here is the stability is incredible. It's kind of like the current V-Core 98, where it's super stable in the sweet spot because there's just a little bit more mass up there. And that also makes it super powerful, super spin friendly. But unlike the V-Core 98, because this has a constant beam, I find it to be incredibly consistent, very controlled considering how much spin and power it has. So it's the type of racket that if it works for you, gives you pretty much everything. The problem I have with it is that this shape is just a little bit too unique. I think if I was just playing with the Boom, I would be so used to it at this point that I wouldn't really think about it when I go back to playing with it. But because of the way mass is distributed on this racket, it's a little bit less whippy, which makes it a little bit less versatile. And I'm trying to develop a more all-court game. Now, it's not like the Boom Pro is bad at the net or bad for touch. I just don't think it's quite as good as some other rackets, which is why I don't enjoy playing with it quite as much. With all that said, this is an A-tier racket. I think it kind of flew under the radar when it first came out, and now more and more players are trying it and realizing just how much potential it has. I think I put it in the B tier last year, but yeah, I think it's an A tier racket, and those variety issues are very minimal. You have to remember, I test so many things, and I'm super analytical about everything I test, so things can quickly get into my head, and I'll go through a racket switch journey in the next 6 months when all the rackets in January come out. And it may be that it stays my racket of choice, and you never know. Okay, so the Pro Staff 97. Now, obviously, this is a super classic design. The actual shape of the racket hasn't really changed since it first came out in 2014, I want to say. But the changes have been basically technological. With this one, it's paradigm bending got added to the throat, which changes up the feel a little bit, makes it a little bit more muted. I think I prefer the previous version maybe a tiny bit more, but this is still an easy A tier racket. I don't want to put it S tier because I do think it's a little bit limited in the modern game. Like, it provides a super traditional experience, but things like spin and power aren't top tier. And I think at this point, if you want to be S tier, you need to be almost elite at everything. But the Pro Staff 97 is still one of those rackets that if you like a traditional, kind of stiffer point and shoot experience from your frame, it's probably the gold standard right now. So easy A tier frame. Okay, so let's talk about the Strike 16x19 and Strike 1820, which are two rackets that weren't on the tier list last year because we were waiting for the new one to come out. And when I play tested these, I hadn't played with a Strike in a while, but these are really good rackets. Now, obviously, they're Babolat's more control-oriented line, but compared to other control rackets in the industry, they have incredible power and spin. So they're super well-rounded. I'm actually gonna put the Strike 18x20 into the A tier and the Strike 16x19 in the B tier. The reason I have the Strike 1820 higher is because it still has incredible power and really impressive spin for an 18x20. But because it is an 1820, it's a little bit more consistent. And I actually find that I can press on the gas with more confidence with this racket compared to the 16x19. So I end up benefiting from that power and spin even more. And another thing I want to say with the Strikes is the feel is actually really good on these. It isn't traditional per se, but it's not undefined the way some other control rackets in the industry feel nowadays. So I really like these rackets. I'm actually considering switching to one of them. I was playing so well when I demoed them with Jonas back in like November of last year that he thought I should switch to them. Okay, so the RF01 Pro. Now, I've said nothing but good things since this racket first came out, and it's one of my favorite rackets right now. I think the way they've executed its target playability is fantastic. Boiling it down as simply as possible, this racket is made for a modern attacking player who likes to take the ball early, dictate points, kind of like what a Pro Staff 97 is supposed to do. Like pro staffs have always been those more point and shoot control rackets, so they're good if you're hitting big and want a very accurate racket. That's what the RF01 Pro feels like, but kind of a modern version of that, because it has a non-constant beam, which gives it a bit more spin and quite a bit more power. Now there is one little issue with the RF01 Pro. It's not the type of racket you want to get tight with. As soon as you tighten up, it does not respond well. The ball kind of shoots off a little bit ambiguously, but when you're playing well with it, it has pretty much untapped potential. Like, it's super stable, it's super powerful, it's super spin friendly, it's quick, so it's good all around the court, and that also means it accelerates through contact a little bit quicker, which again complements that more modern style. So in terms of offensive rackets right now, I think it's probably the best if you want a little bit more of a classic experience. I'm gonna put it S tier. I know some people might argue that. The main issue that the RF01 Pro has is that it is quite a difficult punishing racket, but if you are a really high level player and want this playability, you're not gonna find it many places. So I think it's an S tier racket for me. Okay, now the Blade 100 is a racket that I got a lot of people asking me to test, and for the longest time we hadn't brought it in. We finally did, and I completely understood what everybody liked about this racket. It's super forgiving, it's super stable, and it's very easy to swing because it is quite light with a low swing weight, but unlike some other rackets that have those characteristics, it has fantastic control and really good feel. So it's kind of a magic racket, I think is the way I described it in that comparison I made with the Speed and the Percept 100. Now I think I'm gonna put it in the A tier, not in the S tier, because it's a jack of all trades frame, so it does everything well, but I don't think it does anything outstandingly well. It's just a very user-friendly but still controlled racket, which resonates with a lot of people, but I'm not sure that's enough to put it in the S tier right now. So A tier racket for me. Okay, the Speed Pro. Now there's one thing I just quickly want to talk about with the Speed line, and that's why I've included the Legend Pro here. I just don't understand this paint. It makes no sense to me. No one likes it, this like velvety, rubbery paint they've put on the Speed Pro. I think it looks bad, and it mutes vibrations actually way more than you would expect for just paint. So can we not do these rubbery matte paint jobs anymore? I'm not gonna put the Legend Pro in a different tier to the Speed Pro, but I did just want to talk about that. Now I've actually put the Speed Pro in this part of the tier list, and the Speed MP will be for the more power-oriented rackets. Now the Speed MP is not necessarily a power racket, but I just kind of had to separate them. Obviously the Speed Pro, being an 1820, has a little bit more control. I think the Speed Pro is obviously quite a bit tougher to use than the Speed MP and doesn't represent this line as well as the Speed MP does. The Speed is meant to be super versatile, pretty much good at everything, and the 18x20 string pattern takes away a little bit of spin, obviously gives it more control, but just because of the way this racket's shaped and the fact it has a 100 square inch head size, it's not elite for control. So I'm not sure that sacrifice is worth it. And the fact that it's so heavy makes it quite difficult to swing, and actually ironically not speedy at all. So I'm gonna put this racket in the B tier along with the Legend Pro. I just think it's kind of niche at this point. Like, if you want a versatile racket, there's better, and obviously if you want a control racket, there's better, spin racket better, power racket's better. So B tier racket for me. Okay, the Technofiber T-Fight 305. Now, this is actually kind of a similar racket to the Babolat Pure Strikes because it is a more control-oriented frame, but it also has a ton of power and honestly pretty insane spin for the fact that it's an 18 mainer. This is one of the most spin-friendly 98s right now, full stop. So it's a really well-rounded racket. Kind of like the Strikes, it has a really hefty swing weight, which gives it really good plow through and obviously helps with its power and spin, but that does make it a little bit harder to use. If you want a more modern hitting experience, the Strikes definitely have a bit more of those modern elements. And if you want a slightly more traditional experience, but still really good power and spin, the T-Fight is the one to go with. I think I'm still gonna put it in a tier under the Strike 1820. I think the Strike is a bit more of a special racket, but on the same tier as the Strike 1619. Okay, so the Dunlop CX200. Now, I was really excited to try this racket because constant beam 98 1619s are basically my favorite rackets, but one of the things that's been going on with them recently is that brands are pumping a lot of their newer technologies into these rackets, which changes the feel and control profiles a little bit. So I actually thought, okay, this is Dunlop, they're kind of known for their more traditional rackets. Maybe it'll be more classic than something like the Blade, for example. And that's not really the case. There is a lot of what I call stabilization technology in this racket, which makes the sweet spot really big, really forgiving. The racket, obviously more playable at a lower swing weight, but to me, it just takes away from that control profile to the point where I would say it's probably a C tier racket right now. I know that's a little bit harsh, but when I'm playing with the CX200, I really want classic control to be kind of at the forefront. I do just quickly want to address the fact that I've obviously got the CX200 Tour much higher than the CX200. To me, this technology really complements the more control feel-based playability of the CX200 Tour. Maybe it's because the head size is smaller, so the feel is going to be better, the sweet spot's going to be a little bit more compact, and adding that technology just makes it a little bit better, whereas I think the technology on the CX200 Tour kind of overpowers the racket. So that's why I have it in the C tier. Okay, the Gravity MP. Now, obviously, I'm a big fan of the Gravity line in general. I played with the Tour for 4 years. I think we all know how I feel about the Pro, but the Gravity MP to me isn't quite as good as the Pro and the Tour. I think the more open string pattern with the slightly thicker beam makes the Gravity MP stickier than the Gravity Pro. When I say stickier, I just mean the ball kind of gets lost in the sweet spot a little bit more, which creates a more ambiguous launch, so control is not nearly as good as the Gravity Pro. Obviously, it's significantly more forgiving than the Gravity Pro because it's thicker, it's lighter, so that's a good thing. But I think for really high-level players who are taking a big cut of the ball, one, it needs to be a little bit heavier to be more stable, and two, it's never going to be super controlled because of that beam and string pattern combination. So I think B tier is good. Actually, it's right under the Blade 100, which is a perfect comparison to make. I think the Blade is a little bit more directionally controlled and a little bit more consistent of a racket while still being just as forgiving, spin friendly, and powerful. Okay, the Prestige Pro. Now, this represents a legendary line of rackets, and I don't really want to tear it down too much, but I am starting to get a little bit frustrated with the Prestige. Like, year in, year out, this racket is going down in terms of sales, and they're kind of changing it once in a while. Like, obviously, they made it a 98 instead of a 95 recently, although I say recently, that was 4 years ago, and nothing's really changed since then. Yeah, it's a really traditional 98 1820 that's quite difficult to use. It's quite heavy swinging through the air, and it's not really keeping up with the way things are evolving. I just wonder if Head couldn't kind of revamp the Prestige line and make it more like the Blade line. Now, I'm not saying go that far into power, spin, and user friendliness, but try to develop it and make it a little bit more modern. And there's actually a racket with the Gravity name coming out in a few months that I think is what Head should have done with the Prestige a long time ago. You don't have to scrap the classic playability altogether, but there are ways to modernize a frame without doing that. I think there is a Prestige Pro 16x19 in Europe. It's not available to us. I'd love to play with that racket. I think that would be a big improvement, but I think more than just that needs to be done. So I'm gonna put it in the C tier. Okay, so the Radical MP. Now, there's one thing I want to talk about real quick. When I first saw this RF01 Pro, I thought it was basically going to be a Radical MP because of how similar the hoop looks and also the fact that it has a very similar beam profile. The RF01 Pro is not a Radical MP whatsoever. The feel is much better. It has a much more kind of coherent flex to it. And I think the Radical MP kind of needs to go through a revamp because when it first came out with this new design kind of 10 years ago, it did a really good job of targeting that variety. But at this point, there's so many good 98s that are super versatile, like the Aero 98, the VCore 98, the Extreme Tour, that I'm just not quite sure what this one gives you that another racket won't. So to me, at this point, I'm not really gonna put it any higher than C tier. I know that might be a little bit harsh on the Radical MP. I do think when the next one comes out, if they don't drastically change it, Auxetic 2.0 will be better for it. Auxetic 2.0 does tend to make these non-constant beam rackets that feel a little bit tinny, kind of smooths them out a little bit. So I think that will be overall beneficial to this design. But yeah, I'm just thinking maybe it's time for a radical overhaul. I actually watched Tennis Nerd's video on that Gravity Tour 98, and somebody in the comments mentioned that now we're ready for a Speed 98. And I actually think maybe don't call it a Speed 98, but just make the Radical line more like a Speed 98. So constant beam and yeah, a couple other things here and there. But I think that would be overall beneficial to the Radical line. I do think the Radical Pro is a better racket. It has a thinner beam, so the feel is a little bit better. I think the control is quite a bit better. Obviously, it is a little bit tougher to swing, and I just don't really know if it's competitive with like the best versatile, heavier rackets, but I do think it plays a little bit better than the Radical MP, so I'm gonna put it in the B tier. I think I might have actually reversed these two, put the Radical MP higher than the Radical Pro last year. I think I'm gonna change that this year. I just think there are so many better rackets than the Radical MP in its spec range. But yeah, just a line that I feel like could do with an overhaul sooner rather than later. Okay, the Gravity Pro, I'm just gonna put it S tier. It's such a good racket. It's controlled, it's stable, and the power and spin is pretty impressive because it has a 100 square inch head size. The main flaw with the Gravity Pro is kind of similar to what I was saying with the Boom Pro, but there's just so much weight concentrated, so much mass concentrated in that hoop. I do think it swings a little bit more traditionally within the Boom Pro, but yeah, it's not the most maneuverable racket, and it is really meant to be a baseliner stick. Like Rublev just perfectly encompasses who should play with this racket. It's not that you can't go volley or be versatile with this racket, it's just a little bit more sluggish than some others for that style of play. But otherwise, I mean, this is kind of a magic racket. It's awesome. Yeah, that's the best way I can describe it. S tier racket for sure. The TF40, 305, and 315, I'm just gonna kind of couple these two together. Go for the 315 if you want a little bit more stability right out of the box. I think you have to kind of customize the 305 up to the 315 anyway. But yeah, these are really good traditional control rackets. I think the feel is the main thing here, where there's not much tech and there's foam. So if you like the way foam kind of makes the racket, yes, a little bit more muted, but also kind of plush and still has a very well-defined sweet spot, that's what foam does. I've actually gotten some questions to compare this to the RF01 Pro, so I'll just kind of quickly go over that. The TF40s are way more traditional. These have constant beams. They do have actually really impressive spin for this more traditional profile, but the RF01 Pro just kind of complements that more attacking style really well. These are more traditionally controlled. I don't know if I'm gonna put them in the A tier. I'm just gonna drop them in the B tier and take a look at how that looks with the rest of the rackets here. Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I think they're maybe just not quite special enough to go in the A tier, but in the right player's hands, it's the type of a racket that you're just going to be so comfortable with because it provides such a traditional experience. It just doesn't have any kind of X factor, and I think because of that, I'm not going to put these any higher. Okay, so the Pro Staff X. Now, this is a racket I didn't mesh with well at all. It's got those issues that I mentioned with the Gravity Pro there, where there's just so much mass concentrated in the hoop with that 100 square inch head size and the higher swing weight that it's so sluggish. I think some people like this racket. I haven't really talked to many people who love it, but the big thing here is great stability and slightly more user-friendly than the Pro Staff 97, while still kind of giving you similar ball feel and that point and shoot control. And this is where I think it's just a little bit too niche. People who want a similar experience to what the Pro Staff 97 gives you, but also want it to be more forgiving, that's really who it's for. Yeah, I don't know if that's a big enough target audience to make it a really good racket. So I'm actually going to put it in the D tier, kind of like the Shift 99 Pro actually. It has a bit of an identity crisis. Okay, so the Blade 98 16x19 and 1820. Now, as you guys know, the Blade line is probably my favorite line all time. I think it has gone down a little bit since the 2015 Blade when they basically started trying to modernize this line. What they've been doing is basically trying to make the Blade 98 a more well-rounded control racket. I think feel is the thing that's been sacrificed the most in recent history, trying to accomplish more well-rounded playability, and that's okay. I'm actually fine with Wilson kind of permanessing with this technology because I do think they will one day get to the best combination of all those things where feel is still really good, but the racket's more powerful, spin-friendly, and user-friendly. And I think the V9 has actually taken a significant step forward in terms of feel. I think these feel significantly better than the predecessors, but it's still not perfect. In fact, when I played with the RF01, actually, which is coming next, you can really tell when you play with something that has kind of that more traditional feel in graphite, comparing it to something with these stabilization technologies. It's more mushy, it's a little bit more ambiguous, but it is way better, way cleaner of a hitting experience than it was last generation. So I'm gonna put them in the A tier. I can't really put Blades lower than A tier. Like, these are really, really good rackets still. I know I kind of hint at times that they're annoying me with the Blade, but in terms of well-rounded playability and still giving you great precision and control, they are probably the best 98 square inch 16x19 and 1820 control rackets right now, which is why it's so incredibly popular, by the way. Okay, so the RF01. Now, you can obviously go watch that more in-depth comparison of the Blade and the RF01 if you want to see me get super technical about this. One of the comments in that video was, how can you talk about muted feel or liking the feel of a racket when you use a dampener? I just want to address this real quick. A dampener does not negatively affect feel the same way completely changing up the layup of the graphite does. A dampener mutes vibrations. I completely understand that. When you play without a dampener, you feel way more, vibrations within the racket. But with the dampener, you still feel where the ball is in the string bed. And foam does a very similar kind of thing to what a dampener does. Changing up the layup of the graphite just completely changes the way the ball feels when it's pocketing on the string bed. Like, it'll flex more outside of the sweet spot, but then like flex like way more inside of the sweet spot, but kind of in like a mushy way. Like, it's a completely different feel experience altogether. I don't know. I know sometimes I can get a little bit waffly when it comes to feel, but I do try to describe the sensation that I experience when playing with a racket as best I can, as objectively as I can, and that's how I would describe it. But now the question is, where do I put the RF01? Because I'm still kind of indecisive as to which one I prefer between the RF01 Pro and the RF01. Here's what I'll say. The RF01 is significantly more user-friendly. The RF01 Pro has a smaller sweet spot. It's a little bit stiffer too, so it's actually a little more punishing on the arm than the RF01. But on the flip side of that, I don't find that it has quite as much of the magic that the RF01 Pro has. So you are making a sacrifice to get that more user-friendly feel, which is normal. That's generally how it's going to be. But I think because of that, I'm going to put it in a tier under. I'm definitely not putting it lower than A tier. And I might actually correct that and put it in S tier later. Okay, the Strike 97, guys. I'm trying with this racket. I know this might be like my kryptonite or something. I just don't play well with it. I don't think it feels particularly fast. I think for it to be anywhere near stable enough to be played at the highest level, it needs a lot of weight in the hoop and even some weight in the handle. So it's kind of a tough racket for me to mesh well with. I think they have improved it a little bit with this one. It's maybe a little bit more stable than the VS was last generation, but I can't really put it higher than C tier. One of the things I've heard from people is that it's quite spin friendly. I don't know, I just don't really get that spin. Maybe I'll need Beckett to coach me how to use this racket. So I'm gonna put it C tier, but I can't really put it any higher than that. Okay, the Percept 97. This to me is, the more I play with it, the more I think this is the best version of a modern control racket. When I say modern control racket, I mean a control racket that still prioritizes feel, because at the end of the day, that's what you want in a control racket. You want to feel the ball in the string bed, but is more playable, more user-friendly at a low swing weight. That's the big thing that brands are trying to do with their control lines, is make these rackets more playable at low weight specs, and the Percept 97 is definitely that. You can play with this racket at like a 320 swing weight or even lower than that, but it still feels excellent. And I think part of what it is Yonex developing really good stabilization technology, but the other thing is it might be that the 97 square inch head size is a better combination of still good feel with still being user-friendly. I do think it's still a more punishing racket than the Blade 98. I think the Blade will stay more popular because of that. But to me, the Percept 97 is a better racket than the Blade. I just think it represents a control-oriented line a little bit better. I think it's an S tier racket. And the Percept 97H is a really good racket as well, but because it's heavier, it's not quite as user-friendly. Some people would just kind of customize their Percept 97 up to a 97H. If that's you, great, but you also don't need to do that. So that's why, yeah, you just have more options with the Percept 97, which is why it's S tier. And the VCore 95, I think I actually had this one in the S tier. I don't think I'm gonna put this one in the S tier this time. The more I play with it, the more I'm kind of just waiting for them to take vibration dampening mesh out of their frames, because the Percept feels so much better than the E-Zone and the VCore lines. And the VCore 95 is excellent on paper, insane spin for the head size, really good power and stability for the fairly low kind of static and swing weight specs, and control is obviously good. I wish feel was a little bit better, but on paper, it's a fantastic racket, and I think if the next one comes out without vibration dampening mesh, it'll be a really, really good racket. I mean, it already is a really, really good racket. It's A tier. I'm waiting for no more vibration dampening mesh. No more VDM. I'm not gonna start a chant. So yeah, A tier for me there. At the end of the day, it's still a 95, so it is quite punishing. I don't think the average player should play with this racket, but a 95 with this much well-rounded playability is an impressive feat for sure from Yonex. Yonex keeps impressing me with kind of the revolutionary things they do. Like, yeah, it's a pretty awesome company. So yeah, that's the end of this half of the tier list. Obviously, Like I said, we're going to be putting another like 25 rackets in here. Also, like I said, I've made some controversial choices here, so I am more than willing to hear any opinion in the comment section. And actually, if we enter into a discussion and you can convince me that I made a mistake, I may reorganize some rackets in the next tier list. So yeah, don't hesitate to let me know in the comment section if you disagree with any of this. But yeah, with that said, that is going to be the end of this video. Thank you so much for watching. And of course, as usual, remember that if you want to demo any of these rackets, you can come visit us in store. Or if you want to buy any of them, you can go online at racketsandrunners.ca.